Just when so many people thought the world was on the verge of enlightenment and global peace, war breaks out yet again. And it seems the human race really hasn't changed much at all. That's today's topic on Authentic. It's always a bit risky to comment on world events as they're still unfolding because it's pretty much guaranteed that by the time you're watching this, everything will have changed. As of right now, as I'm sitting here, promised peace talks in Belarus appear to have accomplished nothing, and a large convoy is making its way to Kiev. Hundreds of thousands of people are seeking refuge in neighboring countries, and Putin has even threatened nuclear action against nations who come and help. Now, whether or not that's a bluff, it's certainly not a good sign. And by the time you're watching this, everything's likely to be different yet again. You know, I think one of the biggest surprises I've had is the way people are saying they were caught off guard by what happened, even though Russia has basically been in a low-scale war with Ukraine for close to a decade already. And they've already taken over other territories that used to belong to the former Soviet Union. Political pundits like George Friedman predicted years ago that something like this was bound to happen because Russia felt the need to stop the spread of NATO towards her border and to secure routes for the sale of Russian oil to major markets like Germany. So, for keen political observers and journalists, I don't think there was much in the way of surprise when Russians started to build up troops on the Ukrainian border. And for students of history, a new war in Europe shouldn't really come as a surprise either. The European continent has basically been war-torn since the first barbarian tribes made their way onto the European peninsula. It's an awful lot of cultures and an awful lot of competing interests that are all crammed into a relatively small piece of real estate. So what do we expect? I suppose for the generation born after the Berlin Wall came down in '89, what's going on right now looks unusual and new. But for older folks who grew up in the shadow of both the World Wars and the Cold War, I've got to say, this feels all too familiar. When I was a kid, which wasn't really very long ago, it was common for your parents or grandparents to have spent time fighting a war or sitting in a labor camp. And back in my day, all the Bond villains tended to be Russian. Hostilities that broke out centuries ago between European superpowers linger here in modern-day North America. The tensions still exist, like the tension you continue to find between the English and the French up in my birth country of Canada. The sad truth is, the history of the human race is a history of war, and we've been incredibly naive lately to think that this could never happen again. We are, we tell ourselves, a civilized generation, highly enlightened, and this kind of stuff shouldn't be happening to us. At the end of the day, though, modern human beings are still just as flawed as their ancestors, and the nations of this earth have yet to tame our all-too-human passions and self-interest. The law of the jungle is force. And if you don't get what you want out of this world, most of us will eventually resort to violence and coercion, particularly if we feel threatened. Human lives can become shockingly expendable in a heartbeat as we pursue our material interests. And once somebody starts the ball rolling, once somebody becomes an aggressor, the need for revenge takes over. And people go on fighting, sometimes long after the point where they actually remember why the conflict started. As I read recently in a book written by a Vietnamese refugee, don't make vengeance your god because such gods are satisfied only by human sacrifice. So, as the war in Ukraine either simmers or explodes, who knows what's actually going to happen between right now as I sit here and when this episode finally hits your TV screen. I've been thinking a lot about the way that war has shaped our human experience for countless generations, sometimes in ways that most of us never even think about. For example, if it hadn't been for World War II, I'd probably be sitting in Europe right now speaking Dutch. And who knows who I would have ended up marrying. After the dust started settling in Europe, a lot of people simply moved somewhere else, including my father in the 1950s and my mother's family in the late 1940s. They were both Dutch citizens, but they actually met in Canada where I was born. So, you never know. If it wasn't for World War II, I might not even exist. And even though I was raised in one of the most peaceful environments on the face of the planet, the shadow of that war continued to hang over all of us. One of the German merchants in our small town was always considered just a little bit suspect, as was my German grandmother, who actually moved to the Netherlands and got married before World War II. But a German accent had a way of triggering a lot of people after 1945. There was also this quiet, unspoken anxiety that lingered in the generation that raised me. And I know for a fact that I inherited some of that anxiety in tiny little ways because, well, how could you not? The world had come completely unglued and it changed the way that everybody lived. But you know, maybe the most intriguing part of this is the fact that I have spent a great deal of my life wondering exactly where I belong. I grew up in an immigrant community. I went to an immigrant school, which meant that I wasn't exactly prepared for the cultural differences I discovered when I eventually went to the public school system. We found ourselves to be somewhat different than the other kids. We didn't have long-standing roots in this strange new land, and my ancestors who spoke another language were buried in a churchyard thousands of miles away on the other side of an ocean. Which means that to some small extent I've always felt, well, just a little bit homeless, a little bit displaced. And when you add to that the fact that I'm now an immigrant to the United States and I've moved 24 times in 5 decades, well, I have to admit there are days when I feel like I'm not really sure where home really is. Now, of course, by global standards, I've had it easy. I never spent time in a refugee camp or escaping my country on a leaky raft. I've never been moved to a country where the people didn't at least look like me or share some of my history, unlike a good friend of mine I've been catching up with over the last few weeks. When she escaped Southeast Asia back in the 1970s, she was faced with intolerant Canadian neighbors who would scream at her as a kid, telling her to go back where she came from as she was out playing in the yard. I can't even imagine how lonely that must have felt, because there was no going back home, and the new place didn't feel like home either. The toll of war runs higher than just the casualties. It changes who we are as a society, and it shapes our perspective on the world in 1,000 different ways. You know, I find myself wondering as I watch hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians struggle to make their way to the Polish and Romanian borders, just how much of the 21st century world is actually a diaspora, where countless people now find themselves living very far removed from their ancestral roots. Refugees from some of the worst conflicts of Earth now find themselves scattered across the face of the planet, struggling to make strange places seem like home for their children. When National Geographic did their Deep Ancestry project, they were able to track the movements of ancient people using mitochondrial DNA, which you get from your mother. And one of the reasons that the study is mostly accurate is because once upon a time, people tended to stay very close to their place of birth, which enables you to pinpoint entire populations that are closely related to each other, genetically speaking. Today, you can submit a DNA sample to a number of services that will analyze it for you. And if other members of your family or tribe have done the same thing, it will start lighting up a map of the world, showing you people who share a significant portion of your DNA. And one of the things the data shows us is mass migration, where entire populations are suddenly forced to move. And the longer time goes, and the more this world gets ripped up by war, the further the diaspora spreads. A lot of the world is now populated by people who have no real ties to the land they live on, and no deep history they can claim as their own. The ambition of the world's nations has taken the various tribes of humanity and scrambled them up like letters in a bag of Scrabble tiles, leaving many of us to figure out if we can actually spell anything with the genetic hand we've been dealt. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
North America can hardly claim to be free from war because, well, it's populated by human beings, and so, of course, there are going to be problems. We've been through the Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, War with Mexico, the American Civil War, and countless other smaller conflicts that mean that even this continent is pretty blood-soaked. But compared to the rest of the planet, this has been a pretty privileged piece of real estate, partly because there are two vast oceans separating us from the rest of the world. If it wasn't for that, I strongly suspect that more of the problems people left behind in Europe would have followed them here. But of course, anytime you have people, you get war, whether it's on an individual level, like two neighbors fighting over a property marker, or it's a family level, like the Hatfields and McCoys, or it's rival states trying to pull business away from each other, like Texas and California, or it's actually conflict on a national or global scale. It's all just a matter of degrees, and it pretty much all boils down to the same thing: competition driven by personal interest or ambition. Back in the mid-17th century, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes identified three principal causes of war: competition, diffidence, and glory. Here's the way he described it in his most famous work, Leviathan. He writes, "The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second to defend them, the third for trifles as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalue, either direct in their persons or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name." Now, of course, no matter how you slice it, it's all still the same problem of human self-interest. On the upside, the pursuit of self-interest has pretty much created the incredible standard of living we currently enjoy in the West. It has led to material abundance unseen by any other generation. But on the downside is the age-old problem of scarcity. There are only so many resources on this planet, and we all have to share them. There's only so much oil, and it's only to be found in any useful quantities in a handful of places, which means that not everybody has equal access. Which brings me back to Thomas Hobbes, who said that our natural state of existence as human beings seems to be, over history, a constant state of war. If it wasn't for big political powers that are stronger than individuals, Hobbes argued, we'd probably be at each other's throats a lot more than we currently are. And he kind of has a point. According to the Bible, the world's first murder wasn't an invading army. It was a jealous brother offing his own sibling. So what we did, Hobbes taught, is voluntarily cede some of our personal rights to the state for safety's sake, in the hopes that doing that would improve our own odds for survival. It was far better, we reckon, to live in peace than a constant state of war, because war always robs us of the ability to pursue a productive life. Here's the way he puts it, yet again from his book, Leviathan. He writes, "In such a condition," he's talking about our constant state of war, "there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation or use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Honestly, it's pretty hard to argue that Hobbes was wrong. And you've really got to wonder what the total cost of human war has been, because we've been at this for thousands of years. How many opportunities have been lost because of the way we focus our energies on destroying each other? How many intelligent minds have been snuffed out before the rest of us could benefit from their potential brilliance? How many people have lived under a cloud of apprehension, paralyzed by anxiety and the fear of death, forced to devote all their lifetime energy to just surviving? How many people have found themselves tragically trapped in a war zone, like the villages that sat between the North and the South in Vietnam? How many of those people have had their entire lives stolen from them because they had to spend every waking minute just trying to keep from getting killed? And how many psychological wounds have been passed down through many generations now, preventing countless people from ever finding any real joy? What do you think the real cost of war has been? This is probably our biggest problem. And so to improve our personal odds, Hobbes argued, we created the state, a mutual contract between individuals that supposedly protects us all. But there's a serious problem with that supposed social contract that exists in nation-states, which became obvious yet again when Russian soldiers crossed the Ukrainian border. Nations require leadership, and leaders are human beings who also make tragic mistakes. And leaders are also people with personal ambitions and interests. And it doesn't take long for many people in positions of power to realize that governing everybody else gives you a lot of personal advantage. These people can use the power of the state to advance themselves, and they can become many steps removed from the people they promise to help. Now, I'm talking broadly here, and I'm not addressing any specific people, but just think about this. The people who sit at the top of nation states are not two brothers out in a field like Cain and Abel clubbing each other with rocks. They suddenly have all the resources of a state to back up their ambition. And we'd like to think that most people are not corruptible, but thousands of years of recorded history argues otherwise. Heads of state command an awful lot of resources, so when they go to war, the consequences are much, much bigger, far more devastating than mere conflicts between individuals. All of us have to go along for the ride, whether we want to or not. And that's where the perspective of the Bible suddenly comes into play. In the book of Daniel, you have 4 separate passages that deal specifically with the power of nations and how that's a big problem. You've got Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and Daniel 11. And out of those, Daniel 7 is probably the clearest when it comes to the subject of international warfare. It's a vision where Daniel finds himself standing on the seashore, and he's watching the winds whip across the surface of the water. It's a symbolic representation of the constant strife between nations. And as he's watching, 4 separate beasts crawl up out of the water onto the land. Those represent the Gentile empires that rule the ancient world, one after the other: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And for all intents and purposes, you and I are still living in the shadow of Rome, even though the Western Empire basically disintegrated more than 1,500 years ago. The Roman beast in Daniel's vision has multiple horns on its head, indicating that it would break in pieces but continue to exist in a radically diminished form to this day. The point of the chapter is to remind us just how hopeless human government really is. It's a vivid portrayal of the human struggle for dominance that has existed since the moment we detached ourselves from the Creator and decided to go it alone. Then in Matthew chapter 24, we find Jesus explaining the plight of the world to a group of disciples who are still living under Roman domination. And they're wondering just how long the misery of that occupation is going to last. This is a statement Jesus ties directly to the book of Daniel. And it's something that our generation should probably look at right now. And I'll be right back after this break to show you what he said.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
The Old Testament book of Daniel described the rise and fall of world empires. Essentially, God was showing the prophet the absolute debacle we've created because we figured we could run this place better than the one who made us. We began to live by our base instincts, always looking out for self first, which creates a lot of problems when you're faced with other self-interested people who want the same things that you want. In Matthew chapter 24, we find Jesus describing the problem to a group of disciples who are living under Roman occupation. If the kingdom of God is real, they asked Jesus, then how much longer should we expect this current state of being to last? Now, bear in mind, they asked this question about 1,600 years before Thomas Hobbes was compelled to write about the nasty and brutish condition of war, so we already know the answer. But pay attention carefully to what Jesus tells them next, because it has something important to teach us about the state of our world right now. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places." Now, there's a lot of detail there, including natural disasters and massive religious problems, all of which continue with us to this day. But the part I want you to focus on is this: you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. What Jesus is telling us is that as long as we're in charge, as long as broken human beings are running the show, this is always the way it's going to be. People who live for the sake of self cannot be expected to do this any other way. We're always going to be at war. Even when we think there's peace, even when there's no active battle, we will always live under the shadow of conflict, the rumor of war, and we plan our lives accordingly every single day, just in case. And every time we've been tempted to believe that war is now a thing of the past, it happens yet again. Back at the end of the 19th century, there were really important people making big speeches about how our advanced state of knowledge was going to bring world peace. They said the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution were going to solve all our problems, as if these are just math problems. But of course, they completely overestimated our capacity to abandon self and love each other. And the 20th century proved to be the bloodiest in human history. The communists made the same mistake last century. They refused to understand basic human nature. They believed that central planning and re-education would help us learn to coexist in a way that benefits everybody. And of course, that misreading of human nature ended in the gulags. Now we're faced with a generation that didn't think that what our grandparents grew up with was still possible. Even though outside our own comfy existence here in America, there's been plenty of global evidence to suggest that the next war is only ever a heartbeat away. Now, I know some of you think the Bible is a work of mythology, kind of like the tales from Mount Olympus. But I'd like to suggest that maybe you take another look. Maybe read the book of Genesis. Far too many people have dismissed this as a silly story about a garden and a talking snake. But there's a reason this story has so much staying power. It's got an amazingly realistic grasp of human nature. It tells the story of people that were once deeply connected to their original purpose, their Creator. And then there was a radical break from that original order, and human existence began to unravel. The very first personal tragedy mentioned in the Bible is a man who murders his brother, a story that jars us awake by rudely cutting across all our expectations. We like to say that blood is thicker than water, but Genesis tells us that jealousy and personal interest can be thicker than blood. We mostly expect children to bury their parents, but the very first funeral in the Bible is the other way around. And then, as you explore the story carefully, something fascinating suddenly happens after that very first murder. The children of Cain leave the gates of Eden and they go establish cities. Here's what it says. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod in the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, you've got to ask yourself, what is the purpose of building a city? I'll be right back after this to answer that question.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
All right, we're running out of time already, so I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty quickly. Just before the break, I mentioned that the first recorded murderer built the first recorded city. At the beginning of Genesis, God had provided for all our essential needs. And even after the fall, He laid out a new order for survival, a new way to live. But one man suddenly violates that new order and murders his brother. So now he has to go it alone, away from his family. And what the Bible records is the rise of city-states, a phenomenon that lasted well into the medieval period. And if you think about it, a city is really just an artificial form of paradise. It has a protective wall and the cooperative effort of its citizens to try and generate abundance. It's pretty much what Thomas Hobbes described. Everybody gives up some of their personal rights in exchange for the promise of peace and prosperity. We pay taxes, we obey the rules, we cooperate, and it always works right up to the point where it doesn't. Because at some point, the top dogs are going to override the interests of everybody else. So let's go back to the scenario we found in Daniel chapter 7, where the ravages of war and empire suddenly come to a stop, and this happens. It says, "I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed." You know, maybe, just maybe, there's a reason the Bible calls Jesus the Prince of Peace. We've got thousands of years of human beings doing things exactly the same way and getting the same results, untold misery and suffering. And here we are watching it unfold yet again in real time. But in this book, we have the promise of something radically different, something that's never really been tried by anybody. So maybe it's time to give this another look. And I don't know about you, but I think that if there's a remote possibility that what this book says is true, it might just be worth investigating. And maybe, just maybe, the pain and suffering we're watching in Europe right now really can become a thing of the past. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.